Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It's Thursday, May 28th, 2020. I'm Michael Brooks. This is a Michael Thursday on the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live, different types of steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, historian Daniel Bessner. We're going to be talking about the uprising in Minneapolis and why, actually, given so many factors in today's society, we don't see more like this. We're going to talk about that from a historical vantage point, as well as the gig economy and the hollowing out of academia and how it affects the very production and understanding of history itself with Daniel Bessner. Still no charges for the 4 policemen who were accessories to or the murderer of George Floyd. Most everybody has seen the murder tape. Protests continue in Minneapolis, and folks reveal their quite obvious double standards with regards to these things, from political analysts to the police. 2.1 million more Americans have filed for unemployment, bringing the 10-week total to more than 40 million unemployed amid the corona outbreak, even as deaths pass 100,000. An avalanche of evictions is expected in the coming months as Americans are unable, increasingly, to pay their rent. A bipartisan revolt upends the vote to reauthorize FISA, potential good news. Donald Trump is throwing a tantrum and looking to sign, apparently, or has signed, a new executive order that might jeopardize sort of open communication on tech platforms, though how there was ever real open communication on privately managed monopolies is a mystery. Trump administration preps new arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And Boeing is firing 12,000 people. That's even after being a beneficiary of the CARES Act. Of course, no surprise there. White House considering breaking precedent and not releasing economic forecasts this summer because Donald Trump has plunged us into a pandemic depression. Barr appoints a Texas prosecutor to review Obama's unmasking of officials' request. The Guardian reveals that a new rebranded conservative shadow money group is working hard to suppress the vote in 2020. And tensions still high between China and India and Kashmir. New study adds to alarm of deforestation in Brazil under Bolsonaro, even after a wave of arrests implicates some of his backers and funders for spreading fake news and campaign funding irregularities yesterday across Brazil. All that and more on today's Majority Report. So I'll just say up front, always very excited to have Daniel Bessner on, and we will be able to speak to what's happening from this historical vantage point in Minneapolis to some extent, but also this is also the nature of the logistics that we had this booked, and it's an important conversation. And maybe if there was, maybe things could have been with more filled out, more resources. Basically, maybe we could have punted to next week, but we weren't able to do that. So that's fine. I'm very excited for that conversation, but I do want to just sort of let people know the thought process, some of the logistics around this as well. What's happening in Minnesota is in no way surprising. Frankly, shocked things like this don't happen more. The officers have still not been charged. And I want to be very specific. I think charges that they could bring would be second-degree murder for the cop that murdered George Floyd on tape, and certainly accessory charges for the other 3 officers. When it was announced that they had been fired, of course, they need to be charged with murder. But when it was announced that they had been fired, that was an extraordinary signal at how horrifying this tape was going to be, that the police department or the police union didn't even attempt to spin this one. So the result, of course, demonstrations. There's a violent and aggressive police response. We'll go into some of the obvious disparities between how people protesting a member of their community being murdered in cold blood versus a bunch of assholes trying to handcuff democracy at the Michigan State House, the disparities in treatment. I'm also, I think some people are, I think, frankly, the result of this is probably increased policing. I think we can't confuse absolutely justified rage and action. And I'm very concerned, frankly, about there not being a wave of arrests for these things, and more killing and more violence from the police. But I wouldn't confuse this with shifts in policy. In fact, some of the shifts in policy probably will amount to things like more surveillance cameras and even more aggressive quantitative police tactics. So this is where we are. After Ferguson, the Obama administration made some small steps in terms of consent decrees, in terms of attempting to put some DOJ oversight on these issues. Those were pulled back immediately when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General. Obviously, it would have been done the same, I'm sure, by Bill Barr. And we have a serious problem in this country. It's obviously along the lines of racism policing. It's also, frankly, huge over violence and over policing across every economic metric. I mean, basically everybody who isn't rich relative to any other industrialized country in the world faces extremely aggressive policing here. There's also, go ahead.
I just want to share, this is from 2010, but I imagine it hasn't changed much. Percentage of officers who live in each of the cities within the 75 largest police forces. So cops that actually live in the cities. If you scroll, you have to scroll basically all the way down to the bottom here by Minneapolis with not like barely even like, if you guess double digit percentages for how many white cops live in Minneapolis, you would be over guessing by double because it's about 4% live actually in Minneapolis. The rest live in the suburbs around it.
Yeah. So, and also, and as another kind of line of investigation, certainly some people I've talked to who have worked in law enforcement, and so it's not conjecture. And there've been some reports this way. They say, look, you also need, there's an overall problem of policing and class and race and what neighborhoods get policed and how they get policed and how that interfaces with gentrification and using the police as tools of those policies. That's the structural macro problem. And then there's also the fact that undoubtedly there are people explicitly from white supremacist terrorist organizations that are interested in joining police departments, the military. And that's another thing that obviously needs to be aggressively investigated. So we're going to just play a couple of clips. First, let's play clip number 2. This is very significant too, because I also, I wasn't necessarily, this is just the shift of what you saw people doing in Michigan. And we'll get to the Tucker Carlson clip later, but it's extraordinary because this was it. If you had any kind of sincere belief, and obviously he doesn't, but if you, generally speaking, had any kind of sincere belief in we're having societal breakdown, the institutions can't function, a bunch of armed lunatics with extremist affiliations, let's use very, mainline news language here. Let's pretend we're at ABC News, okay? Without masks, with extremist, racist, potentially neo-Nazi affiliations, go to the Michigan State House without masks, fully armed, terrorize the place. The session ends up getting canceled. Let's play a clip of that. And of course, I'm sorry, I didn't set this up properly. This is in contrast to police immediately coming out and starting to throw tear gas at people, assembling in their community and saying, look, you're not doing your job. That's one way of interpreting this, right? Your job is not to be here to murder and terrorize us. Your job is not to be here to murder someone in broad daylight on tape because they allegedly passed a $20 bill that was fake, and you had them subdued, and then you suffocated them while your colleagues secured the perimeter. So we're going to protest that. That's pretty obvious. These other folks are going to come out without masks because the Zionist world government is made up of fake virus or something. Let's contrast the different approaches here.
What the fuck? Do you see that? What the fuck was that? What the fuck was that? Dude, do you see that? Why are they punching him? Why are they punching him?
So there you have it. And then this one, this is this is an MVP moment that Benjamin Dixon, I found it from Benjamin Dixon. I don't know where it originally comes from. This is, look at this young woman running and basically throwing back a tear gas canister. Let's check out this clip. She runs, sees the canister, chucks it back, and she jogs back.
Hero.
That's a very impressive, very poised athleticism right there in those circumstances. She didn't flinch. She had a solid arc. She took it, she circled back. And that guy was watching her like,
it reminds me of it's like how in the NBA you learn from leagues across like Europe or wherever, like different techniques. Like I saw stuff like that happening in the Hong Kong protests, for instance, and it definitely happened in Ferguson. But like all this stuff is starting to look really similar across the world.
So I want to balance all these things, and I think. Obviously, Ferguson, what actually happened in London, this is almost like 10 years ago now at this point. These things and what's happening here, obviously, there's this serious insurrectionary response to racism, to disenfranchisement, to police violence. Where it leads, how it's mobilized, and also I think some people's tendency to try to graft onto it over social media I think we need to be very tentative about, and we need to be incredibly cautious at what the upshots are of this. I'm imagining some, blue ribbon commissions and some very concerned rhetoric. But I'm also imagining potentially even more aggressive surveillance and policing as well.
I mean,
and in the short term, I'll just shut up in a second, but these guys need to be charged. Yeah. And this isn't, they need to be charged. This is a public health hazard in the highest degree that Derek Chauvin, Alexander Koenig, Thomas Lane, and Tao Thao have not been charged.
Yeah, and it's a scary, hopefully not a sign of a mayor unable to control a police force. And the right. Scary thing is like you look at Ferguson and what happened to the leaders that emerged from that, and a lot of them died mysteriously.
That's absolutely right.
It's just terrifying. So like this is we need to be more vigilant this time around.
Yes. And there needs to be, people are sending resources to help protesters. You got to obviously scrutinize these things really carefully, but there's obviously going to be legal funds and other things to help when there's criminal charges. And then on the flip side, there's also this really serious push that we need for criminal charges against these 4 police, but also, potential civil charges as well. So there you have it. And we will keep focused. The last I saw just before we went on, I guess the mayor has requested that the National Guard come in. So we'll keep attending to this very closely. We're gonna, I don't know, are we gonna take a break or are we gonna go straight to Bessner?
I'll just bring him on now. How about that?
Okay, sounds good.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Daniel Bessner, you're live and we can hear you. And Daniel Bessner is, of course, a professor of international affairs and diplomacy at the University of Washington. He's the author of The Defense Intellectuals, Hans and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals, which is a really great book.
And Democracy in Exile is the...
Wait, yeah. Sorry, no, tell me the full name of it. I don't have it in front of me. Tell me, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It's called Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. And it's essentially about how it came to be that so much of our foreign policy is driven by experts and academics and people like that.
Yeah, and I could tell you that as somebody who, has to read a lot and definitely sometimes, even books I really like, I can't necessarily read every single page. It's just the sort of nature of the beast. I ended up reading all of that book, so it's incredibly well written. It's great, and I definitely recommend people check it out. So
thanks,
I want to talk. Just you actually had a Twitter thread last week where you were asking as a historian, and not you weren't like sort of thirsting for more, for sort of like an outbreak of violence. But you were also just saying, there's a lot of variables at place here. I mean, we've got, 40 million people unemployed. We have a pandemic, 100,000 people have died. And Jeff Bezos is about to be the first trillionaire. We have this horrific, extreme inequality. We have all these other, obviously things like, police violence, murder and abuse, like we just saw with the murder of George Floyd. And you were saying, just historically, it kind of actually is incredible that for all of the extremism in the United States, particularly exemplified by like the Republican governing class and the violence of different state apparatuses, which you track because you also link the connections between foreign policy and policing tactics at home. That it's frankly kind of surprising you don't see more kind of insurrection like we're seeing in Minneapolis. So I guess, what's your sort of broad take on that? I mean, take it in any direction you want to go.
Sure. So what really led me to think about that tweet is from my historical work. So if you look back at the first Gilded Age, or the fin de siècle, or the Gilded Age into the progressive era, turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries, there's quite a bit of political violence across the North Atlantic. Dozens upon dozens of aristocrats are assassinated during that period. In Europe and in the United States, of course, you get Leon Czolgosz, a Polish immigrant, assassinating President William McKinley. So there's this decades-long period where there was a lot of anti-statist, particularly left-wing anarchist political violence that begins in roughly the 1880s and culminates, of course, with the assassination by Gavrilo Princip of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, leading to the outbreak of World War I, right? It's sort of the end of the aristocracy, an era of incredible income inequality, wealth inequality that we hadn't really seen until recently, accompanied by a lot of political violence. Then you also turn to the 1960s and 1970s, and you see, if not quite the same outbreak, something relatively similar with the rise of groups like the Weather Underground in the United States, or the Red Army fraction, the Rote Armee Army fraction in Germany, of coordinated left-wing political violence, which is also linked to organizations like the PLO and Black September throughout the world as well. So it's a question that I've been asking myself for a while. Just why don't you see that same sort of left-wing political violence? And I think it's difficult to come up with any single causal explanation, right? I asked the question on Twitter, and I think I got a lot of interesting responses. For example, people are not quite as desperate, particularly as they were at the turn of the century, in terms of literally going hungry, seeing a ton of their children die, even though infant mortality has increased in the United States, really being totally indigent for a very long time. And you don't quite see that to the same degree. You also do have things like the opium epidemic, widespread drug use, television, pop culture is much cheaper. Consumption in particular is much cheaper today than it was back then. And the consumptive capitalism of the 1960s and beyond is very critical to that. And so I think it's difficult to know, but I think taken together, those answers are probably right in some degree. But then, of course, ironically, less than a week later, you saw this outbreak of violence in Minneapolis in relation to the police killing of George Floyd. And so I think it's a really interesting moment. Now, the degree to which this is properly political violence or sort of an outbreak of rage, obviously one can't clearly separate those, but I think that's an interesting analytical question we could ask ourselves. But it does seem like similar to the riots, and the riots isn't the right word. The outbreaks of rage, I think, is really the right word. Riot is too, pejorative and charged. I think the outbreaks of rage you're seeing right now are similar to what was going on in the mid 1960s with the Watts event in 1965, and of course the so-called long hot summer of 1967. So what is the cause of it now? Obviously, there's the initial impetus of the death. The brutal, violent white supremacist killing of an innocent black man. But I think it's also linked to the fact that obviously people are fed up with the COVID-19 crisis. There's a lot of unemployment. And crucially, weather is actually a really important circumstance that helps lead to these outbreaks of violence. And I think might sound silly, but I believe the best representations of this is Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. If you actually see how sort of hot weather actually does spur people to acts of political violence and violence in general, is a really crucial way to understand what's going on now. But I do think we're going to need to take a step back in a few weeks and understand why this is happening now, and particularly if this is an impetus like what happened during the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. I think that's unclear right now.
Yeah, can this actually be leveraged to have real radical policy changes? And then, of course, how will this be leveraged by, a Trump reelection campaign that can obviously, whip up a base with racial and anxiety-driven appeals around this, which, of course, they've already been doing for quite some time. Now, I want to play this clip. Tucker Carlson, because this is very, I think, clear just in terms of like delineating the different moves that are being made here. Everybody in this audience, or almost everybody in this audience, is already going to have, understand that Tucker Carlson absolutely promotes fear, racism, bigotry. He very cleverly utilizes sometimes very sophisticated economic analysis to leverage for vicious and grotesque policies. But the language he's using here and this appeal to order is double. I mean, it's insincere, it's disingenuous, it's obscene, but it's also I wanted people to understand it in the way of like the way he sort of knows how to program to folks with certain economic concerns. Now he's programming to another group that in some ways are kind of the Biden resistance types. This thirst for normalcy, this deep concern, not about injustice or what the murder of George Floyd represents, or the fact that we're in a Great Depression, or the fact that we don't have healthcare, but the fact that things are starting to feel, quote unquote, out of control. And obviously, you and I think that this way of, assessing the world politically is entirely insufficient. But there are some people who, Chris Cuomo actually was just making an ass of himself last night of saying, like when the violence starts, don't you lose the moral high ground with, this sort of ridiculous, sanctimonious liberal garbage. And I'm also sure that, Chris Cuomo was somebody who didn't like people in Michigan showing up with automatic machine guns and not wearing masks. There's a broad sort of, and everybody sees the hypocrisy and problems in it, because of course, in this kind of broad reach for normalcy and quote unquote order, you're equating people who are expressing rage about a community member that's just been murdered in cold blood by police who are who literally they pay with their tax dollars. Let's use that. Let's remind ourselves of that. Pay them to murder one of their neighbors, and then also and then in Michigan, it's the first wave of kind of reopen protests, I think, did have misdirected economic anxiety because there is no proper bailout. But by the time we got to Michigan, it's just, really can only be read as basically extremist violence subverting democratic norms and institutions in the United States. And that's actually, for all the heated rhetoric, that really is like a proper way of contextualizing those. So the reason I give that long preamble is because Tucker Carlson, who of course caped for people, and he's very savvy. He knows how to, condemn obvious outliers or what may or may not play well. But he certainly was not spending a couple of weeks saying showing up at the Michigan State House with machine guns is a form of tyranny and undermining American foundations of order. So look at how he does this.
So that's what rioting looks like. It happened last night. As you can see, it's happening right now. We want to be clear, we're not showing you these pictures to defend the behavior of individuals on the Minneapolis Police Department. We're not. We're defending society itself. Rioting is the one thing you don't want. Ugly opinions, police brutality, officious bird watchers, rude entitled ladies walking their dogs in big city parks, all of that is bad. But none of it is nearly as bad as what you just saw. The indiscriminate use of violence by mobs is a threat to every American of all colors and backgrounds and political beliefs. Democracy cannot exist when people are rioting. Rioting is a form of tyranny. The strong and the violent oppress the weak and the unarmed. It is oppression.
So can you just explain all the incredible moves he's doing there? And I'm not dwelling on the racism, the double standards are part of it and quite obvious. But I think the broader propagandistic moves of, as an example, equating systemic police violence with personal moral failings in a society where actually I think sometimes, things do sort of get flattened in a social media feed where it's like, oh, okay, this person made an ass of themselves and it can exemplify a bigger problem, but they just, they made an ass of themselves and now they're having their day of shame on Instagram versus a, state apparatus murder. We actually do need to delineate these things. He's making the other end, which is the murder of George Floyd is on the level of sort of like uncouth social etiquette. And the only thing that has any societal implications is actually an uprising in response to essentially state-sanctioned terrorism. But anyways, go ahead, please.
No, I mean, I think the way you just put it was really right. And I want to underline that this is something that you see throughout the history of modernity, which I take to begin with the rise of a real mass politics in the middle of the 19th century, is that you see the dialectic between outbreaks of rage like this, whether it's expressed in the labor militancy of the late 19th and early 20th century, aspects of the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and similar types of outbreaks of political violence. And that argument, the idea that you need to return to normality, or you need to return to normalcy by basically increasing the cause of that violence, which is the state-sanctioned violence, is something that you hear throughout modern history. And I think this is what really unites, in a deep sense, the center with the right wing, is that the liberal idea and the conservative idea that the true affront to democracy is not, as you said, the structural racist violence committed by the police against innocent individuals, or in a more real sense, innocent communities, is not what should be the focus. That is in some meaningful sense normal, because it's part of state behavior, it's part of the state structure. And the way that's juxtaposed with this sort of what is presented by Tucker Carlson right there as abnormal violence is something that you see throughout modern history. And what that usually results in a variety of spheres, from domestic politics to international relations, is a centralization of authority in the so-called in the state that maintains monopoly of legitimate violence. And just to underline that, one of the things that I think the social theorist Max Weber, who wrote from the late 19th to the early 20th century, argued that I really believe is foundational to understanding modern politics, is that what makes the state, what makes it legitimate, is that it contains a monopoly of the legitimate force of violence. Right, that is one of the foundational things that makes a state a state. In the police force, in the army, the state is legitimate because it is able to use violence legitimately. And what Tucker Carlson is definitely unknowingly doing is he's reifying and reaffirming that understanding of the state by saying what the state does is legitimate, even though, we have some bad individuals. Obviously, the killing of George Floyd, Tucker seems to be saying, was horrible. The real problem here is the violence of the democratic public, which is fundamentally illegitimate. And so this is a foundational way that people understand their relationship to state authority for the last 150 years. So the question is, if you're looking at it from a political perspective, I think is twofold. One is, how do you frame the outbreaks of rage as themselves as legitimate as the state use of violence? And two, to lead to two, which is convince fellow citizens that this is as legitimate a use of violence as state-sanctioned authority. And I think that's a really difficult question, because I think what you're indicating, and I think rightly, is that most people who are watching Tucker Carlson, certainly, but most people are not participating in this violence. They're generally not affected by large-scale political structures, even though that might be different during the COVID-19 crisis. Most people generally do want to return to so-called normalcy. Of course, this was the famous Warren Harding slogan in the 1920 presidential election. He promised a return to normalcy. The question, though, is whether the actual COVID-19 crisis and the coming of a Great Depression and the just total collapse of the legitimacy of the system, represented, I still do think, by the success of Donald Trump and to some degree by the success of Bernie Sanders, even though I clearly don't equate them in any meaningful way, whether that provides a political opening to begin questioning some of these foundational assumptions of state and state legitimacy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So now, and one of the other big concerns about this too, I think, is the increasing. I mean, we could sort of use this as an awkward bridge to get to the other half of what we'll talk about. But even policing in general, can you trace, I mean, obviously from the inception, obviously policing in the United States has been inseparable from racism. It's been inseparable from clamping down on labor and other class dynamics. Now, I'll confess, I find, sort of abolish policing to, I'm just sort of not a fan of kind of slogans like that without a really specific, programmatic agenda. And I also think that I know there is a specific programmatic agenda, but I guess tactically I would lead in the reverse direction. I think you could actually bring a fair amount of people on board for a lot of the real kind of radical and absolutely necessary changes embedded in that, who might be sort of confused by that generic slogan. And, that tracks with a lot of polling data. And I think one of the other things that would be concerning about it is I think, today, if the attack on policing as a public institution from where there's political power would probably be more likely to turn it just into private corporate militias, who in addition to the racism and abuse capacities don't have even theoretical public accountability. Now, on the other hand, obviously we might start to see an emergence, and we did see this in Michigan. There was that great move of those local black businessmen who came in with assault rifles to escort the legislator to her job. That was positive and obvious and absolutely necessary. And if that was so maybe there will be things like that will emerge that will be positive. In the macro sense, if police departments start, getting shaken up in major metropolitan areas in the current policy framework, that will mean more privatization. And I was hoping if you could maybe draw the analogy, because we know just like with occupations overseas, there's obviously a huge civilian death toll from the Pentagon and U.S. military period. But then the enhanced use of private security contractors and sort of mercenary forces have added an even whole other dimension to it that we need to be very mindful of, particularly as policing tactics or military tactics from abroad, as well as artillery, have been, brought to bear in police departments across the country.
No, I think that's a great point. And just before I get into that, just two quick things. If I recall correctly, I believe that some of, if not the first organized police forces in the United States were actually founded in the post-Civil War South, specifically to police the freedmen. Right. So it's from the very beginning in this country, directly linked to racial oppression. And just about slogans, I always thought a good slogan, if not abolish police, because I don't think that would find much to purchase right now.
That's not a good slogan.
Is policing equality, that you have to spend equal money on policing white collar crime as you do, so-called blue collar crime or violent crime. I always thought that would be a good way to do it, where, you police banking as much as you do, quote unquote, inner city neighborhoods. But to get to your question about privatization, I think this is one of the fundamental features of the American state. So you have of the modern American state, which I date to roughly post 1945. So in the 1930s, as many people probably listening know, you get the New Deal and expansion of government authority. Beginning in the late 1930s and continuing throughout World War II, which not everyone knows, and into the post-war period, you basically get a conservative backlash. So what conservatives do is that they reconcile themselves to the reality of the New Deal in the sense that the American state is now larger than it's ever been before, and it has much more authority than it ever did. They didn't really think that would itself be pushed back. But what they do is they come together in reaction to create what I call a contract state. And I haven't heard that from someone else, but if I'm taking it, I apologize to whomever that is. But what they essentially do is they argue not in favor of pure public good, but what is famously termed, I'm sure many people have heard of, public-private partnership, right? Is that the American government would essentially serve as a contracting force where it would contract to private groups to provide public goods. Right. And initially this occurred in things like research and in weapons development, but it didn't really occur in areas like policing or the military. However, over the last 25, 30, 35 years, we've seen the spread of the contract state into areas that had always really been considered since the early 20th century to be properly public functions, like the army, like fighting America's wars, or fighting or policing communities. So what we've seen in the last several decades is this spread, the embrace of private, basically mercenaries to fight American wars abroad, and private police forces to police American communities at home. And this, in the United States, at least as far as I know, this is mostly, if not totally, confined to rich communities. So in the city I'm in, Los Angeles, it actually has, the LAPD is actually relatively small, especially when you compare it to New York City's police department. But instead, a lot of towns and municipalities like Beverly Hills, I believe, if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I believe Beverly Hills have their own private police forces, right? This was actually represented famously in the Big Lebowski. Remember, he goes to Malibu, and it's like kind of their own private police force that police the communities, the norms of the community, right? And this is something that you're increasingly seeing. So what we've seen in the United States is the privatization, ironically, of this fundamental feature that I just called the American state, which is the legitimate use of violence. And that's just a part of the longer process of hollowing out state authority, where things that, I mean, it'd be difficult if you ask someone, if you ask an American on the street, anyone of basically any community or identity group, should the army and should the police be private or funded by the government, or government employees? I think the overwhelming majority would say government employees, even though that's not actually what's been going on. Then this is also made even more damaging and problematic by the fact of the militarization of the American police. And I believe I mentioned it on this program before, but Stuart Schrader's book, Badges Without Borders, which recently came out, is really excellent in showing the direct connection between American imperial actions abroad and the militarization of American police at home. Stewart traces it from the 1960s era in Vietnam, but this goes back all the way to the War of 1898 and the American occupation of the Philippines, where a lot of tactics and strategies that were developed to police colonial territories abroad were then imported back home to police American communities. Particularly, unsurprisingly, as I just talked about, the relationship between races and policing is foundational. Particularly, colonial policing methods were brought home to police internally colonized communities, African Americans, indigenous communities, Latino communities, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a problem that's been going on for a long time that I think is just reaching its height right now because of things are being filmed, for lack of a better phrase, that a lot of things that had remained under the radar to sort of the median white voter, white citizen are becoming increasingly apparent. So this is a problem, I would say, endemic to the structure of American policing and American use of violence to contain its own population that is just beginning to be questioned in a way that it should have been for decades, if not at least a century.
So let's pivot a little bit. In every section of this conversation, this is kind of an awkward transition, but it actually makes sense. Historicizing things. There's few public exercises more important than historically situating where we are. That helps give us a material view of reality, that helps us understand the velocity and trajectory of institutions and different patterns of politics and economics. And so history is a really important ground, and it's certainly a contested ground. The sort of fights about how we're going to process the past and, how we're going to understand where we came from and so on. But in, more recent years, and in this, piece that you've sent me, which is a review of a really fascinating new book called The Gig Economy and the Meritocracy Trap, you're talking about how what is a major labor story, which is this complete gutting out of the academy and the undermining of the academic job market, certainly in humanities and social sciences, also has really big public implications for basically the capacity to think publicly and understand who we are and where we came from, where we're going.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's actually connected to what's going on in terms of the outbreaks of rage and the unemployment crisis. Because what's happened to American universities is that they've basically taken on features of the so-called gig economy. What is meant by the gig economy? The Amazon warehouse worker who isn't given enough hours to earn health care, the Uber driver, the subcontracted cafeteria worker. These are all people who have a general experience of precarity, which I do think is contributing to the rage that we're seeing throughout the United States on all sides of the political spectrum. So what's happened over the last 30 years? Yeah, so there's actually a direct connection of precarity, and I think an experience of precarity really unites most American workers across collars, from blue to white collar to one could add the gigging journalist, right? And so one member of the gig economy is the adjunct professor, or the staff worker at part-time staff worker at universities, or the subcontracted cafeteria or maintenance worker at a university who basically works on contract. So just to give a little bit of background, in the last 30 years, the American system of higher education has undergone a process of neoliberal corporatization, where essentially jobs that were considered relatively stable in the past, for example, a professor, an administrative assistant to the dean or what have you, or a maintenance worker or janitor at a university, jobs that were pretty much relatively stable have been adjunctified or precariatized. As university administrators, informed by a neoliberal ideology, have sought to cut costs at the expense of pretty much everything else. So, for example, roughly 75% of professors in American universities are not what are considered tenure track professors. There's no way to get tenure that is a permanent job. And that's problematic because when you have tenure, you're able to be controversial, like, for example, I am on Twitter, and more importantly, teach controversial topics or research controversial topics without fear of being fired. So what's happened now in university systems is that basically everyone is precarious. So why does this matter? It matters first and foremost because study after study has demonstrated that precarious professors, precarious staff members, precarious university workers are not able to develop the types of relationships that they've traditionally been able to develop with students, which leads to just negative student outcomes. Fewer people graduate from college, fewer people are able to transfer from 2 to 4 year universities. There's a rise in student depression. There's a decline in student achievement, generally speaking, because learning, as we all know, is social. And if you're not able to develop social relationships, if professors aren't able to develop social relationships with their students, students suffer. So first and foremost, as college ironically has increased in price, and as students have taken out tens of thousands of dollars in debt to attend college, the university educations have actually gotten worse because more workers are precarious. So that's one. And two, what is really important to me as someone who's dedicated themselves to research, and I'm sure to many people who are listening who care about things like history, right? Historicization is a very important political act. It helps us denaturalize the past. It helps us denaturalize the present and see that there are other alternatives, is that you just are seeing a decline in knowledge production. So histories that would have been written in the past are just not being written because when you're an adjunct professor, you get paid $3,000 a class and you're working at 6 different universities to make whatever, $20,000 a year. You're not really able to devote yourself to research and the production of new knowledge. And this is especially true in the humanities and social sciences, but it is also true in the sciences. And it basically just leads to a terrible life. So one of my good friends, a guy named David Parsons, who actually hosts an excellent podcast called The Nostalgia Trap, I recommend everyone listen to it. He was just fired at no notice in the autumn. He works for the California State University system, and he just received an email saying, sorry, enrollments are down, you're fired. So he's out of a job, and he's not going to be able to do anything to basically make an income. And this experience is paradigmatic of people throughout the gig economy and the gig academy. So it's paradigmatic of the gig academy, which is reflective of the larger gig economy. So I just wanted to highlight this because I do think American the American university system is about to face an apocalypse. COVID-19 is going to slash states' budgets, which have already been slashed in the last 20, 30 years, particularly after the 2008 crisis. And perhaps even more importantly, it's going to prevent a lot of foreign students from enrolling at American universities. So what happened after the 2008 crisis is that in order to make up for budget shortfalls by the state, universities switched to enrolling more foreign students because, frankly, they pay more for higher education. But if these people aren't going to be able to come back to the United States, either because Trump does something, as seems to be happening today, or because they're afraid of contracting COVID-19, or if they're afraid of racism and xenophobia, the American university system is going to experience a serious budget shortfall. So I'm just emphasizing this because if people care about education, they care about history, they care about the production of new knowledge, we need to basically all come together and persuade our fellow Americans and also state legislators about the importance of university education, both because it's the right thing to do and both because we want to be a society that has a history.
How can we track this incredible paradox that there used to be much more of an understanding in, say, the kind of post-World War II through the 60s, that education was in some sense a public good, that people from different class backgrounds should have access, going to college shouldn't be prohibitive there. And at the same time, there was certainly, much clearer doorways into the middle class or the professional class, if you had that capacity, in terms of, if you could make it through law school, you were probably going to get a good job. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other factors that play in, and nepotism and social networks and everything else. Absolutely. But there was this funny paradox where it wasn't, there was a lot less of an ideology of education needing to have a specific economic output, even as it did have an economic output. In the last several decades, it's turned into just a calling card and a brand, even as the power of that brand has diminished significantly in terms of what it will actually buy you in employment opportunities and income in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I'll try to keep this brief. So in the last 3 decades, I think that shift is due to the rise of neoliberal ideology, and that's reflected in a variety of ways. Perhaps most importantly, you begin to see things like the board of regents of university boards of regents throughout the country, instead of consisting of sort of community leaders and most importantly, retired academics, you begin to see like corporate leaders move into boards of regents. And with that happening, you begin to see the imposition of a corporate logic onto the American university system, which is, at least in its ideal form, and wasn't really a business, but it starts to be treated like a business. Universities become obsessed, for example, with maintaining control of patents that are created on their system. Famously, Google was founded by 2 Stanford University graduates, and Stanford didn't on Stanford equipment, and Stanford didn't get anything. And so there's that sort of anxiety about getting the product of your research. But what's also interesting is I think that we can't, unfortunately, separate the explosion of higher education in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s from the Cold War. So on one hand, a deal was essentially made between the government and white soldiers in the United States, where because they fought for their war, because they fought World War II, they were going to be able to get a higher degree, and that would have been an engine for social mobility. But also, crucially, the American government begins to really fund the higher education system in 1958. Why? What happens in 1957? The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite in space. And so that fear of Sputnik basically freaks out the American government, and they begin to pour millions of dollars into American university systems, basically to ensure that we have a scientifically educated populace. So there's always been, at least in the moment of its greatest explosion, the American university system has always been informed by a security logic. And perhaps, unfortunately, you see that happening today, right? I'm reading a book right now for a future review, and the argument made for higher education is that if we want to compete with China, we need to have a highly educated populace. So what I'm hoping to do, right, exactly.
And the same day, there's legislation from Cotton and Blackburn, just this kind of most rank, embarrassing xenophobia about blocking Chinese graduate students from STEM. Yeah.
Exactly. So just to wrap up, what I'm curious about is whether it's possible in this country to have a funding of higher education that's not directly linked to security, to national security logics. We haven't had it really, and I hope we can, but I'm a little bit pessimistic.
How would this relate then? I mean, there's having a bigger public argument, which is really important, but I think is obviously going to be very hard because obviously we're in a depression. There's another wave of austerity. All sorts of immediate material needs are under attack. And then other than a kind of broad public argument, which is important, what's the sort of concrete mechanism? Like you occasionally hear and I think one of the actual elements of this precarity economy is sort of, all right, well, I mean, these workers are on strike. Great. Maybe we can, at least, talk about these McDonald's workers or give them some attention, or maybe, or obviously if you have the capacity and there's a GoFundMe that's real, you can donate to a strike fund. These things are concrete and important and tangible, but that hasn't been sort of systematized yet. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly. Yeah, I do think there's two things, and I just want to highlight a lot of the information I'm talking about comes from this excellent book called The Gig Academy by Kazar, Scott, and DePaula. So if anyone wants more details, please check that book out. But I think essentially that there are two ways to do it. One, within the American university, professors for the first time in U.S. history share a work experience that is far more similar to staff and subcontracted maintenance and cafeteria workers and the like than they ever have before. So within universities themselves, you can't limit things like unionization just to professors, but you have to take all jobs together. And I think that's actually true across the economy. Sectoral. Again, the life of sector. I think it's called cross-occupation organizing when you're doing it within an industry, and then also cross-sectoral organizing in the sense that the life of an adjunct professor is much more similar to an Amazon worker than not. So I think that, again, you need the sort of within the university cross-occupational organizing, and then without the university cross-sectoral organizing. And this is actually really important, I think, question for organizing theorists, is that in the absence of the factory, right, the single location where people go to day after day and form social bonds and form communities, nowadays you have like the Uber driver who's totally alienated and doesn't know her or his fellow colleagues, right? So how do you basically get workers to have consciousness of the shared experience of precarity both within and without their industry? Because I personally think this is a shared experience across the American political economy that we need to be centering as a left. Now, that's a really difficult question, but I think that's the only way that we're going to get any sort of transformation. I think if you, for example, just unionize union workers or just unionize adjunct professors, that you might get short victories or short-term victories, but you won't get the sort of transformational victory in the political economy that we actually need. It's a really difficult question. I don't have an answer, but I think those are two meaningful strategies, and the authors of the Gig Academy talk about both at more length.
I actually asked President Lula about that when I interviewed him. Because he was talking a lot about, since he was released from political imprisonment, one of the things he talked about in one of his first rally speeches was actually the Uberization of Brazil and how that was related to, attacks on unions and pensioners. And, he definitely, he had some very important and visceral instincts, as he would, about, he had this image that he painted of like, somebody's like, it's pouring rain and they're on a scooter and they're like delivering your pizza, essentially. And, they have no foundation and no respect from the government, no bonds. And essentially like, that's like the new person. Like if, people should watch the interview, but like that needs to be the kind of center of the decision-making and policy-making today. But it also was definitely, it's tricky because just even physically the foundations of, you don't want to idolize like being a metal worker or something. It's not fun. But, you're hundreds of people, you're in the same spot. You're also not as totally surveilled as you are in an Amazon warehouse today, where your every micro movement is being processed and a terror. I mean, this is one of the reasons the Amazon has a higher rate of injuries on the job, because every step is quantified to maximize efficiency. So yeah, these are definitely
which is
the
just
new barriers.
sort of exactly, and that's an upshot of sort of Taylorist management strategy of the early 20th century, where he was literally measuring movements in order to try to get the most efficient thing. And I think when we look back on it, even in 5-10 years time, we'll see that one of the things that neoliberal economic practices did was that they destroyed social bonds. And those are, of course, social bonds, community bonds are one of the foundations of solidarity. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to overcome a political economy that is clearly not benefiting the overwhelming majority of not only Americans, but people in the world, is that these social connections are just totally destroyed. Started with deindustrialization, is now basically reached its apotheosis, where the algorithm is determining who gets what and who is employed, right? Another interesting thing I just want to mention is that this has actually come along with the destruction of middle management, right? You don't need middle managers anymore. Algorithms have essentially replaced middle managers. So it's important, because this is an experience that is not just traditional blue collar, it is also traditional white collar, right? And it really, and you see that by the fact that I just mentioned that Amazon warehouse workers and adjunct professors, people with PhDs, share a lot more in common than they did ever before in American history. And so this is, I think, a really crucial thing to center, as Lula said, now and going forward until we, reach a post-capitalist society.
Well, Daniel Bessner, appreciate your time as always. Everybody check out Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer, The Rise of Defense Intellectuals, which actually, as you can see in the course of this conversation, can give us some insight on this situation as well. And of course, you can follow Daniel on Twitter and, read his writing and all the places that you would expect to see writing like this. So Daniel Bessner, thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Take it easy. Bye.
Take care. Bye. All right, folks. Become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. That's how you get the whole thing. Check out Just Coffee, Tea, Chocolate, Tea, Coffee, and Chocolate. That's a great thing. That's a model we need to be supporting, the co-op model, very important. On Tuesday's Michael Brooks Show, we talked with Dustin Dino Guastella of the Teamsters local in Philadelphia, and also Philadelphia DSA. We talked about why Bernie lost, why we need a class war, not a culture war, strategy moving forward, and seeding candidates from the labor movement, what that actually looks like on state levels. Second part of our two-part illicit histories of the rise of modern communication and propaganda with Mark Ames and how that relates to the history of shock therapy and neoliberalism in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we're working on another two-part illicit history on Pakistan, from today, Imran Khan, back to the foundations of the Saudi-U.S. Mujahideen relationship and how it affects the world we're in today. Check out Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Go to patreon.com/TMBS. And of course, snag a copy of Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. Great new review of it written by the very smart, very insightful Ralph Leonard. Matt, what's cooking? You're muted.
Tonight, twitch.tv/literary hangover, I will be doing probably another stream on Red Dead Redemption and Fatal Environment by Richard Slotkin, The Myth of the Frontier and the Age of Industrialization.
When Cornel West mentioned that, just lit up.
I've been crushing it with, I forget what the other reference was, but I think Zizek or maybe it was Adolf Reed referenced another.
Adolf Reed. It was an Adolf Reed book about the founding.
About
something like what was it? That was a provocative title. It was like something on.
It was Ancient Patriarchs.
It was like Ancient
Nasty Wenches and something else by Kathleen Brown about.
That's the one Adolf mentioned to us.
Yeah, and it's about how the sort of Virginia government in the 1600s basically used race and race and gender specifically, like codified those into law in ways that would develop into, we could naturalize them nowadays. But yeah, so check that out, twitch.tv/literary hangover.
And also you could check it out, of course, on Patreon and subscribe on iTunes. Jamie, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
What's cooking?
Cool. So this week on the Antifada, we had on Winnie Wong, a former senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign. More importantly, for our purposes, an anarchist, and as well as a UFO, someone who takes an interest in UFOs. So we had a nice long talk with her about the Bernie campaign, what went wrong, where we can go from here, and how it fits into her overarching radical political horizon. We also released an episode this week that Sean did with Terrence from Trillbillies. In our feed, it was a cross post about Origi's The Long 20th Century and World Systems Theory. It's really interesting. I learned a lot from it. I encourage everyone to check it out. Also, I just have to re-up my recommendation. If you want a different take on prison abolition and police abolition and why they are crucially important for the left to care about, check out our episode with Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing, as well as our episode with Nadja from No New Jails.
All right, we're going to see you guys in the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's a good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 eighths. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're not paying.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me...
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
I remember that debate. That was an incredible. Go back into the archive. Watch those debates. What was that guy's name again? I don't remember his name.
Daryl Perry.
No, that wasn't Daryl Perry.
Not Block.
Yeah, Walter Block. Yeah. Hey, shut up. It was incredible that Sam was so, and I get it, he's like, all right, no, this guy, this isn't just some idiot calling up saying that we could exchange Bitcoin to not have, contracts put out on us or whatever. This is an economics professor. And he got all ready. And then the guy was just like, shut up. That was definitely, if that sort of thing amuses you and you haven't seen it yet, I would definitely go back into the archive. I want to cover this first. So USA Today reports that 2.5 million more Americans are filing for unemployment, bringing the 10-week total to more than 40 million. 1 in 4 American workers, according to the New York Times. The number of Americans struggling to make ends meet continues to grow, even as the economy began to restart after virtually shutting down to slow the corona pandemic. About 2.1 million Americans filed initial unemployment benefits last week, the Labor Department said Thursday. In just 10 weeks, 40.7 million have sought jobless benefits that represent the nation's most reliable gauge of layoffs. The report marks the 8th week in a row that new jobless filings dipped from a peak of almost 6.9 million, but the level is still far above historic highs. So, this is just something to track, that we're not obviously going to be coming back anytime soon. We're in a really disastrous situation, and we're, as we keep outlining, right? We've juiced the Fed. That bailout fund from the initial CARES Act can go up to $4 trillion. That basically Steve Mnuchin has no accountability, no governance on, that he can pump into the financial system. And there's been no proper social provision. So even as these unemployment rates continue to skyrocket, there's an anticipation that we're about to have an eviction crisis. And state municipalities are basically allowing it to go through. Are we still on, guys, or are we having a connectivity problem?
No, I think we're still on.
We're still on? Okay, great. I just, it froze for me for a little bit, but
no, you're good.
I'm glad we're going. Okay, so I'll quote, I just want to pair these two things. This is from the New York Times. An avalanche of evictions could be bearing down on American renters. The United States, already wrestling with an economic collapse not seen in a generation, is facing a wave of evictions as government relief programs and legal protections run out for millions of out-of-work Americans who have little financial cushion and few choices when looking for new housing. The hardest hit are tenants who have low incomes and little savings even before the pandemic. And it goes on to explain how, as an example, in many places, the threat has already begun. The Texas Supreme Court recently ruled that evictions could begin again amid the nation's second largest state. In the Oklahoma City area, sheriffs apologetically announced that they plan to start enforcing eviction notices this week. And a handful of states like Ohio had few statewide protections to begin with, leaving residents particularly vulnerable as eviction cases stacked up or ticked forward during the pandemic. So no bailout for people, no proper social infrastructure to protect them during this. Another massive infusion into the financial sector, which is going to consolidate monopolies even more so in the coming decade. And a push to reopen, which has quickly become obviously just a tool of, as an example, Republican governors that don't want to pay unemployment insurance. Now we get the next kick in, which is no protection for evictions. Now, apparently, according to this article, 90% of renters had actually paid full rent through late May. But nobody expects that number to maintain itself. And, what does this lead to? I mean, obviously, a massive amount of preventable human suffering, but it's also going to mean that, just as we saw in the last couple of years, even though all the trends around inequality and quality of jobs were still very bad, that just with a certain amount of growth in place, you were seeing, as an example, companies pull back on, in certain cases, like running credit scores on people, all these other kind of coercive tactics they would have on prospective employees, because there actually was some genuine job growth, and it was at least starting at the margins to relieve some burdens around people looking for jobs. Not systemically, it still happened all over the place. But we know that wages, that background checks, that bad contracts, precarity, lack of protections, which were already the trend over decades, is going to get a massive injection with basically a huge surplus, viable, could be employed, but unemployed population. And there's still no policy mechanism in place to do anything about this.
Yeah, I mean, this is why tenant organizing is so very important right now, because we have to assume that no help is coming from the government for renters, right? And we're stronger together. Like, I hate to use a phrase from Hillary Clinton. Oh, God, gross. But like, when you
definitely
organize,
do better when you're about to talk about the need, and I agree with you about tenant organizing. But
when you organize,
Hillary
together,
Clinton is not what you want to be thinking about.
You know what?
Tenant organize.
I free appropriated it. Okay, I am the Hillary Clinton of talking about communism. I don't know. Anyway, when you organize,
I don't know about that print.
You have more power.
Abolish the police. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no! I did it to myself.
We talked about it on the Antifada.
But like, seriously, and the people who can pay the rent are protecting the people who can't pay the rent. Like, I'm doing a little bit of this stuff right now. Don't want to go into too much detail, but it's so important for the people who can pay the rent to be organizing in solidarity with the people who can't, because the amount of money that they stand to lose from forgiving the rent for the people who need it is dwarfed by the amount of money they stand to lose when everyone who can pay the rent stands in solidarity. It's just math. And like, the price of going to housing court, it's a nightmare. The landlords don't want to do that. That is a last resort for them. So if you can make it more annoying for them to go to housing court, kick everybody out, which can take like a year, and find new renters for a whole building or a number of buildings during a pandemic when no one wants to rent an apartment. They'd rather not do that. They're going to just give up the money. They have margins. They have mortgage relief right now. Renters don't have rent relief, but at least in New York City, landlords have mortgage relief. They have more wiggle room than they say they do, but it only works if a lot of people do it at once.
So you have to cautiously and thoughtfully, create not message boards, but threads that you can maintain some privacy around, and figure out safely different ways of communicating, maybe even non-tech ways of communicating with your neighbors, so you can start exploring doing that type of thing, because the problem is only going to get worse, as you say.
Just one button on this. In 2016, this is according to the Washington Post, unemployment was at 4.7% in 2016 with 3.7 million evictions. We're at 14.7% now and approaching 20% total unemployment. I mean, just imagine how bad this is going to get. It's going to be
absolutely bad. It's
going to be like Trumpvilles in the way that like Hoovervilles looked during the Depression, I'm afraid.
As all this is happening, we've reached a depressing, disgusting milestone we knew we would reach, which is that 100,000 Americans have died in less than 4 months. This is from the Washington Post. The death toll from the coronavirus passed the hard-to-fathom marker on Wednesday, which slipped by like so many other days this dark spring. One more, anyways, it goes into some sort of, frankly, unnecessary kind of poetic language. But I just want to remind everybody, one, some new reporting from David Sirota on Andrew Cuomo sending people back into nursing homes in New York that were not safe and not prepared to deal with the coronavirus. Leaders across the country downplaying this to begin with, telling people to still go out, like Mayor de Blasio. Republican governors and Supreme Courts, like in Wisconsin, comparing the most basic and obvious safety measures to Japanese internment and forcing people to reopen just so they can shut off people's unemployment payments, even as we're in a pandemic Great Depression. And of course, at the base of it is an absolutely narcissistic, grotesque president who bears ultimate responsibility. And people need to remember that. And I want to just quote a little bit. I actually didn't. I'm sorry, guys. I'll just quote it. I should have here. I'll IM it. So maybe you could throw it up on screen if you want. I should have given it to you earlier, but I just want to pull a couple of quotes from this Edward Luce piece that I know I've said it before, but everybody should read this piece from May 14th in the Financial Times, Inside Trump's Coronavirus Meltdown. And I'll just quote briefly. When the history is written of how America handled the global era's first real pandemic, March 6th will leap out of the timeline. That was the day that President Donald Trump visited the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. His foray into the world's best disease research body was meant to showcase that America had everything under control. It came midway between the time he was still denying the coronavirus posed a threat and the moment, and he said he always known it could have ravaged America. Shortly before the CDC visit, Trump said, within a couple of days, the infections are going to go down close to zero. In the U.S. then had 15 cases. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear. A few days afterwards, he claimed he felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. That afternoon, the CDC provided an X-ray into Trump's mind at the halfway point between denial and acceptance. And it goes into explaining basically in great detail how this sort of ricochet and volley of denial and conspiracy theories and acceptance was, of course, all mediated through his anxiety and his own, fears around his economic numbers and reelection, and obviously zero concern and zero real substantive concern for American lives. And I'll quote briefly a little bit more. What has gone wrong? I interviewed a dozen people, including outsiders who Trump consults regularly. It goes on. Again and again, the story emerges of a president who ignored increasingly urgent intelligence warnings from January, dismissed anyone who claimed to know more than him, and trusts no one outside of a tiny coterie led by his daughter Ivanka and her husband Jared Kushner, the property developer who Trump empowered to sideline the best funded disaster response bureaucracy in the world. And this is, of course, all going back, as we always state, to dismantling of the pandemic preparedness section of the National Security Council in 2017. The psychology, last quote, the psychology behind Trump's inaction on COVID-19 was on display that afternoon at the CDC. The unemployment number had come out this morning. The U.S. had added 273,000 jobs in February, bringing the jobless rate down to a near record low of 3.5%. Trump's reelection chances were looking 50-50 or better. Any signal that the U.S. was bracing for a pandemic, including taking actual steps to prepare for it, was discouraged. Jared Kushner had been arguing that testing too many people, ordering too many ventilators would spook the markets, and we shouldn't do it, says a Trump confidant who speaks to the president frequently. That advice worked far more powerfully on him than what the scientists were saying. He thinks they always exaggerate. 100,000 deaths. 100,000 deaths.
It's getting to the point where, like, the best you can say about this administration is we haven't had a nuclear incident yet. Like, I'm imagining 3.5 years ago, a future me visited myself and I could ask him a few questions, be like, okay, does something happen with nuclear weapons? And well, he gets rid of the Iran deal, but okay, I guess we can deal with that. And then I get quiet when I ask, like, how about a pandemic? Does that happen? Because that's what, like, I remember thinking, like, when Trump won, like, what are the things that could happen that could make this really be a disaster as opposed to, a run-of-the-mill Republican disaster? And it's this sort of thing. He puts his dumbass son-in-law in charge of pandemic response. a 100-year pandemic. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I mean, in terms of nuclear war, I think one saving grace about Trump is that he's a coward. Like, he likes to tweet aggressive things, but he has very little appetite or attention for actual hot war. And I'm hoping that that will keep them from doing anything too stupid with regards to China.
Check out, I have, on Tuesday, TMBS, we actually did about 20-minute deep dive. No one has pulled out of more global arms control treaties than Donald Trump.
Yeah, and selling arms around the world to everyone who wants to buy them just only adds fuel to the fire.
Well, that's absolutely true. And look, the fact that the United States is the world's global leading, arms supplier is a structural problem and absolutely bipartisan effective U.S. foreign policy. And we'll talk about a new arms sales package that's being prepped for Saudi Arabia in a minute. But specifically, George W. Bush pulled out of key arms control treaties, including Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Treaty. Trump just exceeded him, pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty, which emerged actually in 1991. It was sort of, my understanding, was the last major arms control treaty created by the United States and the Soviet Union right before it collapsed. It was a project that went back as an idea to the Eisenhower era, but was created by George Herbert Walker Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, and basically allows surveillance across open skylanes. So, Russian planes can fly overhead, we can fly in Russian airspace and so on, and basically, verify that there aren't additional weapons developments. This is the new thing that they're stepping out of. And we also quoted, I do recommend people watch the TMBS episode on this, but there was a piece in Reuters where Trump's nuclear envoy said explicitly, we are prepared to spend Russia and China into an oblivion in a new arms race. So this stuff is right back on the table. And actually, this is another one that's very important. I mean, John Bolton, that, the resistance was so excited about, tweeted in praise of pulling out of Open Skies last week. And the Republican foreign policy of not only ripping up these agreements, but also an interest in tactical nukes on the battlefield, something definitely the Bush and Cheney administration looked at. So, I agree that he talks a lot, but I also know that they are absolutely undermining
and let's hope
whole arms control infrastructure. This isn't a very fun half.
Let's just hope he doesn't have to respond to some other country using one too. It's not just him using one, but Trump navigating like India, Pakistan, or something that is just horrifying. World threat, just unbelievable.
Yeah, he just doesn't. This is the stuff. It's again. It's so overblown because people get fixated on his tweets and all this crap that doesn't matter. Or occasionally, again, he says things that resonate obviously with a lot of people and that are, true or defensible about tariffs or whatever, in the sense that we just need to, again, just that constant cycle of outrage achieves absolutely nothing. And at the same time, it needs to be balanced with the fact that, this guy does not have the capacity emotionally to deal or psychologically to deal with stuff like this. And I think this Edward Luce piece in the Financial Times is so great because it isn't, oh my God, can you believe he said blah, 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 blah. It's a meticulously reported, including with a lot of people close to the administration, that just tells you that's what this guy does. You have this ridiculous little trust fund baby psychopath telling him it will spook the markets. That's enough.
Wouldn't it be great if we could actually x-ray his mind just to grab onto a fun image from that article? What's in there?
It's sort of like floating fast food remnants.
Yeah, I was going to say empty fry box.
Yeah.
Like when you see inside Homer Simpson's mind and it's like a monkey on a bicycle.
Right, exactly. Speaking of which, this is actually, I want to go to clip number 8. This is, I don't know. I don't even know if this is, there is a certain sick, not even humor to this. It's just unbelievable. And this certainly, I mean, Donald Trump is the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is him. This is a state rep in Pennsylvania, Brian Sims, and he just got told the following information, that apparently a Republican colleague of his in the Pennsylvania State Senate had tested positive for the coronavirus, and apparently Republican leadership knew. And the guy just kept showing up for work, and they didn't tell the Democratic colleagues. So, I mean, I'm sorry to laugh. I would be absolutely as fucking livid as this guy is. It's disgusting. But, you know, of course, I mean, Rand Paul apparently went for the swim in the Senate pool while he was awaiting his test results. So these people definitely embody the change they seek in the world. Let's play this clip.
I think this is on. Hi, everybody. Representative Brian Sims here. I am in my office in the House of Representatives. I just walked back here from the House floor. Today has been one of those kinds of days where I hope in the years to come, the decades to come after I finish serving in elected office, that I hope I'm able to sort of put out of my memory. I sort of don't exactly know where to begin. This morning, apparently, House Democratic leadership learned that for as much as a week, perhaps longer, that House Republican leadership knew that at least one of their members had tested positive for COVID-19, that other members who'd been exposed to him would eventually go on quarantine, but they didn't go on quarantine until they were done serving alongside us, especially those of us that serve on the state government committee. So for those of you that know, the Pennsylvania House of Representatives under our gerrymandered Republican leadership has been perhaps the most active state legislature in the entire country. And during that time period, during the entire COVID-19 crisis, the state government committee has been the place where all of these fucked up bills to pretend that it is safe to go back to work have been going. And every single day of this crisis, the state government committee in Pennsylvania has met so that their members could line up one after one after one and explain that it was safe to go back to work. It was safe to go back to race car driving or dog grooming or getting your hair cut. Meanwhile, what we're learning is that during that time period, they were testing positive. They were notifying one another, and they didn't notify us. I just spent the better part of the last 11 weeks sitting across a room from people who would eventually test positive and decided not to tell us. They did do some kind of quarantine. They did do some kind of contact tracing, they, I guess, being Republican leadership. Russ Diamond, apparently, many of you know as the person that has led the charge to open up the legislature, screaming every single day in committee about how we were safe and how there wasn't a risk, has apparently been quarantining himself for weeks. Of course, he didn't explain that to any of us when he was in committee, talking with us, or walking up and down the aisles, or bumping into us, or letting us hold the door open for him. I kind of don't even know where to begin. Let me tell you a little bit about why this is so fucking dangerous. First of all, let's start with the Democratic chairman of my committee, Kevin Boyle. Kevin Boyle's got 2 young children. Kevin Boyle every single day comes up to this Capitol and then goes home to his wife and kids, his 2 young kids, and nobody decided to tell him that it was okay for his kid to be exposed, but not for these members. I know one of the members put out a statement saying, I was looking out for my family. Well, you were exposing our families. One of the members of state government has a wife who is immunocompromised. Let me tell you why it matters to me. Fucking A. Let me tell you why it matters to me. I wasn't planning on talking about this until after the election, but in January, I donated a kidney. I secretly donated a kidney to somebody in my city, somebody who lives blocks away from me who was dying of renal failure. I'm so proud of having to do it, but it was not for public consumption. It was for my friends and for my family and for my staff. And every single day that our gerrymandered Republican leadership has been calling us up into this building so they could pass these ridiculous bills pretending that it was safe to be out there, they were covering up that it wasn't safe. You have no idea how the people around you are impacted, and that's why it's so important to notify people. So here's what needs to happen. Here's what I think needs to happen. First of all, Mike Turzai, the Speaker of the House, needs to resign. And any member of leadership that has known what was going on, any member of Republican leadership that knew that members were testing positive, that other members were being quarantined, and did not tell those of us who were exposed to those members, needs to be investigated by the Attorney General. And I think that there needs to be prosecutions. Holy shit. Holy shit, exposing all of us up here to this crap while covering up what was going on, while simultaneously telling people, telling families that it was safe to be outside, that it was safe to be interacting with other people, while you were testing positive, while you were quarantining the people around you, while you were doing contact tracing, and not notifying a single Democratic member who has to show up here every single day for this crap. There is no legislature in the country that it has met as much as the Pennsylvania legislature, and there is no committee that has met in this state legislature as much as the state government committee. And we have had to listen to this succession of members coming before us, telling us that this was fake, that this wasn't real, that there was no risks, all the while knowing that they were testing positive and withholding that from us. So I've got my eyes right now on the Republican legislature, and there's a bunch of things that I want. I want a full-blown investigation by the Attorney General. Every single member of Republican leadership that knew that this was happening, I want an investigation of what kind of contact tracing that they did. The entire Democratic House of Representatives today had to jump on a call with the Secretary of Health to figure out if it was safe for us to go back to our families. I'm in a building right now surrounded by members that can't go see their kids, that are having to call their husbands, having to call their wives and saying, honey, I might have exposed you and everybody I love in this world because one of my colleagues tested positive, but he was protecting his family, but not protecting mine. And Republican leadership protected him. I want a full-blown investigation by the Secretary of Health. I need to know if it's safe for us to be back in this building. This building needs to be scrubbed top to bottom. Holy shit. I can't believe that this is happening to me at work today. I cannot believe that this is what we are going through. People always say the parties are the same, or it doesn't matter this party or that party. You know what the difference is? The difference is values and credibility. And every single day that I've showed up at this gerrymandered legislature, I knew that the Republican leadership that was out there was fake and it was false and it was looking out for themselves. But I never, ever, ever knew that the Republican leadership of this state would put so many of us at risk for partisanship to cover up a lie. And that lie is that we're all safe from COVID. That lie is that social distancing isn't important. One of these people, Russ Diamond walked around the House floor every single day without a mask on. Just a little bit ago, I was on the House floor, and at one point, only 4 Republican members had their masks on. Holy shit. It's
fucking disgusting. I mean, I agree with him entirely. And
we talked about the.
I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
We talked about sort of conscious psychopathy with the Amy Cooper thing and how she knew she was sort of operating basically machinery that could kill somebody possibly. That's exactly what the Republicans did here. Like, they knew enough to take procedures to like contact trace themselves. They knew that so they know the risk there. And they continue. So, like, when he says, I don't know that it'll happen. I don't know that we have a justice enough in this country that can prosecute, members of state government for doing something like this. But that is attempted murder by proxy from where I'm standing. If I'm on that jury, I say guilty to attempted murder. Because, I mean, yeah, that guy gave a kidney. I just imagine how pissed off I would be if I had been unwittingly, like, what if you were caring for an elderly person or something?
Yeah.
And you'd been exposing them the entire time.
Of course.
In like attempted murder by proxy, and that they should completely be tried for that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that seems like it's breaking down right now is just the civility that exists between all of the members in any legislative body, right? Like, Republican senators and Democratic senators make a big deal about being friends with each other. They shake hands, they drink at the same bars. And I think maybe it takes something like this for a lot of Democrats to realize that Republicans are their enemies and maybe they shouldn't be friends with them. I mean, maybe something good will come of this. I don't know. I would like to see Democrats being that mad about all of the things that the Republicans are doing, dropping F-bombs and whatnot, right?
I mean, I think, this guy's also working at the state level where I think there's probably some more effective representation in the Democratic Party in some ways. But I also think, it's incredible because the truth of the matter is that in order for systems to work, there does need to be some basic ground set between people. The reason all that kind of like buddy civility shit is so disgusting is because when they're sitting down and having beers and working together bipartisanly, it's usually because, they're both taking care of the arms industry together, or the pharmaceutical industry together, or passing something like the CARES Act together. And that's why it so correctly repulses so many people. And at the same time, like, in order for even in a radically reformed system, any type of legislative body to work like this, there does need to be some basic ground rules. Like, we might hate each other and battle. I'm not going to knowingly put you at risk and your family at risk of getting the coronavirus. I mean, that is, look, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's exactly what you would expect from them. But it is absolutely, it's a step beyond. I mean, people used to talk about, like, why isn't, like, could brawling ever happen in the United States? Like, could there be fistfights in the floor of the House? Like, you would look at footage from other countries, and sometimes people might, get into the brawl in Parliament or something.
Well, it's in our own history as well.
This is way worse than that. This is way, way, way worse than that.
This is a foundation. Warfare.
I mean, this is just, look, I get hesitant, it's just let's just call it what, I mean, it's just, it's endangerment and negligence. Like, I actually like, let's try to be really specific about this, because this should be criminally investigated, and they should actually be looking at, what the consequences should be. It's something like this is pure negligence. I want to, be careful, because I noticed there was a draft a couple of weeks ago from Bill Barr's Justice Department that was potentially looking at exposing someone to corona as terrorism. And, I always get very wary.
Yeah, let's not.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's be super, let's not make, because this happens so often. It's like the correct impulse of the outrage is to try to move in the reverse direction of these things as much as possible, not add to them. But that being said, before we even get into terrorist rhetoric or any of that, this is reckless endangerment. And it is not like...
And there's a conspiracy.
I mean, like, these are all things that, under the parameters of the law we already have, that this could be criminally investigated. There is no need for terrorism discourse. There's no need for, like, it's just like, you knew that you were jeopardizing your colleague's health, and you coordinated to lie about it. Right there. It's there.
Oh.
I mean, imagine, like, weren't there, I'm not as up on this history as I am, but wasn't there, like, scare stuff about AIDS and people, like, intention, like that sort of stuff? Like,
absolutely. It was considered historically groundbreaking in the 1980s when Orrin Hatch, conservative Republican, hugged someone who had AIDS. And again, I mean, honestly, historically, to his credit, it meant something, because he was showing you that, you obviously don't treat people poorly because they, have this disease, and also that it cannot be transmitted by shaking hands or hugging somebody. So yeah, I mean, of course, there was a million homophobic conspiracy theories about how AIDS spread. Absolutely. And these guys are sitting here
just going
like, we need to fucking reopen, man.
Like,
we need to get back to work.
And the guy in this video is gay, so maybe that adds another layer of historical memory to it for him.
So disgusting.
Do any of those homophobic conspiracy theories actually add up to what Republicans are actually doing right now in front of our eyes?
No.
In scale.
No, not at all. So yeah, That's unbelievable. I don't think, by the way, I mean, I think someone was asking about this. We don't do the calls and IMs are set up upstate with Sam.
Yeah.
So we don't have that capacity on Thursdays. So that is why. I do want to cover this. This is according to a new report in the Daily Beast. Trump administration preps new weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. When State Department Inspector General Stephen Linick was abruptly fired, one of the inquiries he was conducting concerned a massive, highly controversial weapon sale to Saudi Arabia. Now the Trump administration is preparing to sell Riyadh even more weapons, the Daily Beast has learned. Two individuals familiar with the situation, including one with direct knowledge, said the Trump administration is drafting another request for a significantly smaller package of arms that includes precision-guided munitions similar to those Secretary of State Mike Pompeo approved in a highly contentious $8 billion sale in 2019. Congress voted to condemn the sale and is likely to push back against the new one, too. The proposed sale comes 2 weeks after President Donald Trump fired Litnick. The prospective arms sale also demonstrates the entrenchment of the Trump administration's bond with Saudi Arabia. And this is what a word this is. Right as Riyadh's punishing war in Yemen and grisly murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi has seriously eroded Congress's trust in the Saudis. Let's be clear. The war in Yemen could be rightly framed as genocidal. It has hammered from the outset just absolutely indiscriminate killing by the U.S.-backed Saudi and formerly they've lessened their involvement, United Arab Emirates forces. The U.K. and the U.S. have supported with things like refueling. There's also contingents of troops that have been kind of subcontracted from the Sudan through Saudi Arabia. And this has not only led to, it's one of these places that you cover and the stories of, a school bus bombed, a funeral bombed, a wedding bombed, a school bombed, a hospital bombed. It's a daily murder spree by the Saudis with active U.S. support that began under the Obama administration and deepened and developed under the Trump administration. And yes, there has been seriously valiant fighting led by Bernie Sanders to try to end this. That was, incredible work by Sanders and some others, including Chris Murphy and Mike Lee. But the arms packages became, the more significant part of what made the arms packages controversial was the abduction and murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which was also an incredibly disturbing thing. And that was what made people like Lindsey Graham, who were very close to the Saudis, all of a sudden skeptical and willing to speak out against MBS. But, it's just another one of these areas where arms are one of our major exports. We provide these for markets across the world. Saudi has always been one of the prime recipients. Saudi barely even has it doesn't have a particularly powerful army. It has a lot of armaments and it has a close relationship with the United States to provide those kind of services. And of course, U.S. troops being stationed there after the Gulf War was one of the justifications that Osama bin Laden developed for al-Qaeda terrorism. So it's a reflection of broader U.S. policies in places like Yemen and arms sales generally. And it is incredible the extent to which Trump and Pompeo are specifically committed to it, both in terms of, the bang for the buck, but also really what is just the genuine depth of the relationship. And don't forget, I believe Saudi Arabia is the first place Donald Trump visited as president. When I don't know if everybody remembers that sort of horrifying incident where they were touching the orb together. I'll just quote a little bit more from the piece. It appears that the new round of arms sales comes outside of Pompeo's 2019 emergency authorization. At that time, Pompeo pointed to Iran arming insurgents in Yemen and their use of Iranian ballistic missile targets in Saudi Arabia to justify the declaration of emergency. Now, that's what the Saudis claim, that this the Houthis in Yemen, who they're fighting against, are Iranian-backed. They've actually become significantly more, although they still are autonomous, but they have become more closely connected to Iran since this war began. And yes, I would agree with Brendan that pushing arms sales across the globe is not exactly helpful to any notion of stability and security. So we saw, most people have seen the murder in broad daylight of George Floyd, which has led to this protest and insurrectionary actions in Minneapolis that we were talking about in the beginning of the show. The fact, and this is nothing, there's nothing positive about this. I mean, it's stunning that they still have not faced murder charges, but you could really anticipate how horrifying this video was, that these people were fired immediately without even an attempt from Minneapolis Police Department to spin this. I mean, they were just let go. And you know, I don't know how to process those videos in terms of, clearly there's a lot of people that need to see these things. They need to understand that they happen. And I think it's also a lot of people, especially people who, you know, like Black men who are most likely to be on the receiving end of this type of murderous terrorism, don't necessarily need to, you know, see a snuff film. But the point is that it was so clear, and Judge Napolitano on Fox News, who is, you know, I guess actually particularly by Fox standards is willing to sort of, you know, sort of push back against some of the prevailing narratives on Fox. He's going to have a very clear take on this. And it's interesting. I mean, you'll see across right-wing media, obviously there's some of the just straight up racist and murder justifying sort of voices. Then there's the, you know, hey, this was bad, but it has nothing to do with anything. It doesn't point to any large scale problems. And here is Judge Napolitano, I think, frankly, from a prosecutorial standpoint, making the most basic and obvious point here.
Make of this, will these officers be charged?
Well, of course they should be charged. I mean, if I were the Attorney General, and I applaud the president for suggesting, and of course he can do this with a phone call, ordering the FBI to investigate. But if I were the Attorney General, I would, Bill Barr would call up the Attorney General of Minnesota and say, why are those 4 officers why have they not been charged with murder? Why are they free? Why are they not in jail? We have a video of the murder. If you guys don't do it, we will. So there's 2 violations here. There's murder, and then there's the use of legal force to deprive him of his civil rights. The murder is the state crime. The use of force to deprive him of his civil rights, in this case, the right to breathe, is a federal crime. The cops can actually be prosecuted for both. As horrific as the response has been and as unjustified as these riots are, they're probably not going to stop until the cops are actually arrested.
All right, Judge, and we'll look at this. And by the way, the riots, the best.
That's amazing. So he feels a need to feed the Fox News narrative and reduce people's, first of all, obviously, most of the protests are just protests. They weren't, you know, a lot of people who weren't engaging in anything were still hit with tear gas and rubber bullets. Then there's people who have been expressing rage by breaking windows of a precinct, which, you know, these officers that committed this murder came from. So he feels a need to feed the you know, the dishonest racist narrative that Fox is going to try to shift the focus on. But he does do it in the context of saying exactly what the incident took place was, being shocked that charges haven't been filed yet, and charges absolutely need to be filed, both the state and federal charges he outlined well there. And then even at the end, even after he indulges the bullshit quote unquote riot narrative, he still basically is like, yeah, but you know, this isn't going to stop till there's an arrest. So I mean, on the legal part, he actually just does that really well. But it's interesting watching somebody like how he is still working in bounds of this right-wing propaganda context to push a different narrative. It's a correct narrative, which is interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, I don't know where the jurisdiction falls on this, but it's interesting. He mentions the AG, which is Keith Ellison, and I've been looking up like
I think it isn't it the DA.
Does it fall
though?
to the DA? Yeah.
I think it falls. See, I'm going to assume because I look. Thank God Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of Minnesota. So I would assume, it's very good that he's there with regards to prosecuting this case. But I don't think I think actually the judge is wrong about that. I think the Minneapolis DA is the person who's going to be responsible, at least out of the gate, with putting charges forward.
Yeah, that's Michael O. Freeman.
Michael O. Freeman. And the mayor of Minneapolis himself has actually sort of publicly stated his shock that there hasn't been arrests yet. So, I mean, we don't know, but obviously we'll continue to follow closely. And of course, there needs to be murder charges here.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. I also, though, rather than seeing cops punished after the fact, I don't want to see this happen anymore. Like, we're all so sick of it. And it's disgusting that a lot of white people need to see it on video in order to believe it and in order to care about Black lives, right? Like, study after study and city after city has shown that the only way to substantially increase the safety of the public in poor neighborhoods and in Black and brown neighborhoods is to reduce the budgets of police departments and stop building new jails. And you can call it abolition, you can call it whatever you want to. A lot of people working for these policies are working within an abolitionist framework, just like socialism. That's a pie in the sky goal, but there are things we can do in the here and now to advance that goal. And that's always what I'm talking about when I talk about abolition, because I don't think any of us want to see this happen any more times.
Well, of course, absolutely. I'm not going to get into a whole sort of debate about it, but I'll just, you put forward what you think, and I'm going to just put forward in 30 seconds what I think, which is that never allow the slogans and the things that can easily be used to divert a conversation from really important, concrete reforms, changes, and material delivery be used to allow to subtract from those substantive goals. And a lot of slogans do that and serve that function when you're talking to a broader public across all racial backgrounds. The most police that I know personally are definitely people of color. And obviously, actually they have really complicated and mixed feelings about policing, as most people do. So the point is to leverage directly what can be done so that we actually achieve these urgent things that need to be achieved now, and we don't allow sloganeering to interfere with that. So that's also, it's fine.
I think the thing about the lowering the budgets gives us a lot to work with, though, because I think like austerity for cops, or however we decide to frame that, is going to be going to be a pretty mass buy-in thing, especially on the progressive left.
So I agree with that. The concern then becomes the private militia and corporate aspect of it, because the context now and what we were talking about in the first half is looking at a place like LA, where LAPD has been somewhat, it's not as big as NYPD, and there's a lot more private security contracting. So in a context now where there's no actual policy movement, there's no power position to do that in terms of winding it down, the vacuum that will be filled is actually from private contractors that are even less accountable because they don't even have the theoretical public obligation. So we need to just be really careful and specific about it, and absolutely 1,000,000% push for those policy changes against police violence and surveillance, period. I mean, one of the things also when you look at the numbers, in addition to the obvious racism, is also the class dimension that occurs across the board, and also the fact that the United States has unusually and deeply violent policing across the board, and people are deeply over surveilled, and we need to take all of that on.
Yeah, and that's why this is not a fringe issue, abolition or whatever you want to call it.
Well, let's make it not a fringe issue by, being really thoughtful with the language. But of course, these implications, these things are, of course not. I mean, and nothing, and nothing that affects, the ability of life of any part of the population is a fringe issue. Of course not. Do you guys want to watch something and hear something embarrassing and stupid?
Yes. Just
a slightly more in the fun half ethos?
Sure.
Joe Scarborough, who an enterprising...
He's been in the news a bit lately. There's a private citizen or a public official who in private capacity has been calling for some aggressive investigative journalism around Joe Scarborough. It's actually really horrible. Joe Scarborough, though, again, obviously he and Mika have barely even paused to apologize for their role in treating Donald Trump as great fun and entertainment while they helped pave the way to the White House for him because he was in the joke. Joe Scarborough, not only does he not have any self-awareness to really analyze his own role in pushing Trump forward as an entertainment product, he doesn't even have the self-awareness to step away from his music pursuits. He had a song about 9/11, and now he is covering a Paul McCartney classic as an homage to frontline workers. Now, if Joe Scarborough starts advocating for hazard pay, federal jobs guarantee, and single payer, I'll give him his music rights. Short of that, I'll refer everybody to Donald Trump's Twitter feed. No, I'm just kidding. But let's play a Paul McCartney song.
That she's just a girl for me. I want all the world to see we've met. Lie, 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 lie. Had it been another day, I might have looked the other way, and I would never been aware. As it is, I'll dream of her.
This is the most embarrassing thing I've ever seen.
Lie, 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 lie. Falling, yes, I am falling, and she keeps calling me back again. Falling, yes, I am falling, and she keeps calling me back again.
Kitsch.
I can't even answer.
Yeah, no, I can't make you watch any more of that.
How did you find that, Brendan?
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's just these things come to me, and I have to take them in.
It's sort of like it's an intensification of the phenomenon whereby the people in rich neighborhoods at 7:00 every day just hang out of their windows clapping for each other.
Oh, like, yeah, there's a scene here where they
workers, but
they show that.
It's for each other. Like, it was so surreal.
Way to wait for that pizza delivery. Good stuff.
Yeah, that whole like segment of shots looks like the Upper East Side only, basically.
Yeah.
This happened in Prospect Park the other day when I may or may not have been on a journey of sorts through the mind. And it was so surreal because everybody on the lawn, there were no essential workers. There were just people on picnics, and they just started clapping. And I'm like, who are you clapping for? You clapping for each other? What the fuck is happening right now?
Yep.
Very similar vibe to this.
That's just. I mean, there is nobody in Joe Scarborough's life, least of all Mika, saying, Joe, that's pretty fucking embarrassing, bro.
It's so embarrassing.
There is no one that is looking out for him.
Yeah, because everyone on his team, I'm sure, is just like, I can't fucking lose my job right now. Of course I'm going to edit this video together to look like, I don't know, like an Elvis Costello video from the early 80s.
Yeah, what does you do? It's like, I lost my job in the once every 100-year pandemic during a Great Depression because this guy, his former congressman turned like morning establishment coffee kvetch show is really genuinely bummed that he wasn't like the next Elvis Costello.
Is anybody in a relationship? Anybody? I mean, we don't have IMs today, but maybe tomorrow the IM theme can be. Do you have a relationship like that with your boss? Where
yeah, call in with those stories.
Yeah, like what are you putting up with that you probably wouldn't?
I mean, every time we have to fight Sam off of doing a replacements cover. I mean, that's taking a lot of energy. I want to do a replace, and it'll be about the essential workers.
I say we let him do it.
I remember because I heard the replacements at Connecticut College, and Benjamin and I, we were out very late the night before, and it was right when there was VHS tapes of Monty Python, and we were going to watch one, but then I put on the replacement records instead, and I want to do a cover of that record, but it's about the essential tort lawyers. Sam wants to do tribute replacement cover for the tort lawyers.
I would love to see that.
That's actually not bad. We're actually creating some legit content here. I'm not mad about that at all.
Benjamin could play the keyboards on it.
Oh, yeah.
So we are beginning some level of reopening, even as we have passed 100,000 coronavirus deaths. Fox News, we played yesterday, actually, Sam and I, we played Sean Hannity trying to sort of cover his tracks a little bit after being one of the main figures in mass media at the time when this could have been contained, to call it a flu, blow it off, and help facilitate the catastrophe in the White House that Edward Luce reported on and we talked about before. Tucker Carlson took it very seriously, leveraged it for anti-China nonsense, and now is also saying essentially that we should reopen. And of course, this is not a question of not wanting to pay people's unemployment benefits, not a question of course, not creating any type of social infrastructure that people could expect with regards to housing and healthcare. And of course, obviously not about saving people's lives, particularly when we see demographically across race and class lines that the folks that are dying in the main are clearly not folks that Laura Ingraham or the Republicans or the most Democratic leadership are concerned about, certainly not the donor class. It's even deeper than that, according to Laura Ingraham. This is about whether or not we will be contained forever.
The angle, of course, isn't saying that the coronavirus shouldn't be taken seriously. We take it very seriously. The human toll, the economic toll, of course, we passed 100,000 deaths. It's just been heartbreaking. It's the enormity of it is it's sometimes hard to even take in.
Pause it.
What we are saying at the same.
Laura Ingraham pretends to care about 100,000 people dying like a kid pretends to have read a book. I love that. It's Moby Dick. I mean, it's it was a big one. 100,000 people dead. Totally not into it.
There is a much greater chance that she cared about it like that Brazilian finance minister who's like, well, it's the pensioners that are dying, so this is going to be good for us.
Paul Guedes, the darling, he's a member of Bolsonaro's cabinet that the Wall Street Journal and others were very into because he's a serious economist. And yes, video leaked of a cabinet meeting, and Guedes said, actually, this could be great because primarily old people are dying, so it will be good for our pension obligations, which is, I have no doubt, the perfect encapsulation of all of these people's response to this. But let's finish Laura Ingraham. She's muscled through pretending to care about 100,000 people. And now she's going to tell us what's really going on.
Time is that states that have given more trust to their own citizens are doing better than the states who treat their citizens like school children. We believe that pastors at the local church are going to do, I think, their best to balance their duty to God with the duty they have to the safety of their congregations.
Just do your best, 2 Corinthians.
And we believe that local, like high school football coaches, are going to balance their duty to their schools with the duty to their players and preserving their health.
The duties.
We believe that local restaurateurs, yes, will
boys.
figure out how to best balance their desire to stay profitable with their duty to keep customers and workers as safe as possible. And look, if they slip up, this is where the free market comes in. They'll either be sued, they'll go out of business, or both. Customers. But let's face it, some elected officials never liked the free market that much. They prefer to keep a lot of you deplorables locked down and afraid. They want you masked, not just during this virus, but until the end of time. Because remember, there'll always be another potential virus lurking out there right around the corner. And don't you want to protect others? What kind of monster are you if you don't want to wear a mask forever?
So this is actually really, I mean, this is interesting because we need to okay, so let's first get rid of, the basic propaganda here. New York has been worst hit because, in fact, Cuomo and de Blasio did tell people to keep going out and keep going to restaurants and bars well past when they should have. And in fact, there was that Columbia University study that came out, I think last week, that said something on the order of 36,000 lives could have been saved. And that primarily would be in New York because of population density, among other things, if the lockdowns had gone into place earlier. And that is due to Trump at the top and due to Cuomo and de Blasio's recklessness and at the state level. I mean, honestly, Trump and Cuomo should be at The Hague for this, as far as I'm concerned. Then we also look at, and unfortunately it's horrible, the numbers are starting to show up in other states. They're starting to move fast in Alabama. This isn't gone yet, and it is going to reach more places.
Yeah, they're juking the numbers everywhere too, or not everywhere, but they're juking the numbers in these states.
And they also interpreted the virus not having been there yet to them having bent the curve. So they're like, "Oh, mission accomplished!" Like the enemy isn't here yet, you idiots.
Exactly. Now, I think on the other hand, I want to say that there is going to have to be a left discourse that absolutely, of course, says, I mean, look, the basic public policy point is that there should be a social infrastructure and public good provisions so there can be a lockdown that can safely happen. And I don't even like the word lockdown. So people can quarantine themselves as long and as safely as they need to and have food, housing, healthcare, and shelter taken care of, period, full stop. That is the whole argument that we're making all the time. That's why we're so disgusted by these bailouts that have done absolutely nothing systemically to protect people in this crisis. That's the public policy point. Now, the next wave of it, and I think we need to have a very clear third way, frankly, a clear left position, because the right is going to lean into conspiracy theories. They're going to lean into the fact that there isn't a social safety net. And they're already accelerating the reopening. They want to do it to punish, people taking unemployment. They don't want to pay unemployment. They want to coerce workers back out into the market as quickly as possible. And those are, again, that is just in the interest of capital and control of capital over the workforce. And if you look at plans for places like New York City, it's not a question of the masks per se, but absolutely people like Andrew Cuomo are talking about how to turn this place into a quote unquote smart city. How do we turn education into the hands of Bill Gates more so? Maybe it's okay if a bunch of independent businesses go out of business. Maybe it's okay if we push more jobs into the vicious, precarious sector that Daniel Bessner and I were talking about earlier. Maybe it's okay if we have even more reductions in what few genuine middle-class jobs remain. And in that sense, yes, there is a market incentive for, let's say, the kind of delivery economy for people to normalize a fair amount of these things, staying home into perpetuity, for longer and longer periods of time. The, order and deliver economy outside of any relationships, either socially with other people, obviously, but even around, brick and mortar stores, which are actually very important to protect in terms of anti-monopoly politics, which is not the be all end all as far as I'm concerned, but it is part of what we have to factor in. So, we don't want to just have this, there needs to be a clear line of argument about the social protections people need to safely quarantine for as long as they need to. And then when people do step out, the kind of policies and world we actually want, which is not to stay inside atomized pods and have food delivered to us with, no labor protections and, even more higher rate exploited, precarity class. So there's a very clear lane here that needs to be carved out, and the right will be able to make a lot of hay of it if we don't.
Yeah. I mean, she's doing this kind of double dance too, kind of like Costco Kevin was doing as well the other day, where they have to acknowledge that it's real now, right? Too many people have died to pretend that it's not real, but then question other things about it, say, oh, we don't know how the virus is transmitted necessarily. All of these measures, they're too much. And it's not a coherent position, but they're going to do it anyway. Also, she's talking about free market competition. She doesn't seem to understand what would actually happen on the market if states open up too soon, which is that the businesses that stay closed out of an abundance of caution, or maybe they're listening to the science, they're going to suffer because they have to compete on the marketplace with the places that did open up. And we're not going to know the negative consequences of that until it's too late.
Without a doubt. All right, folks. That's it for us today. Sam will be back tomorrow. We will be back next week. Check out the Antifada Literary Hangover and TMBS. And we'll see you all soon. Everybody stay safe. Thanks, everybody, for making the show possible. Stay safe.
It might take all the strength I've got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks.